Welcome back to Coordinating Clinical Trials. My name is Steve Pope and I'm your instructor. This week we're going to be talking about creating informed consent forms, or ICFs. So the important thing to remember is that the ICF, the informed consent process, is indeed that, just a process. It's not just the signature of a subject on a form. So this process includes the ethical and legal requirement designed to ensure that participants fully understand what they're signing up for and can make that decision without any kind of duress or coercion. So the informed consent document, the form that's used to collect that consent, must contain comprehensive information to ensure that participants can make an informed decision about their participation. So the document must be clear, concise, and written in a language that's understandable by the participant. Let's take a look at our learning objectives. We're going to discuss the informed consent process. We're going to cite the required elements of an informed consent document, or ICF. We're going to define the required signatures that are needed on that ICF. We're also going to practice creating an informed consent document. And then finally, we're going to identify the responsibilities of the person obtaining consent and the subject giving consent. So let's talk about when the informed consent process actually begins. So we've got an introduction and an invitation to the subject to participate. So you have initial contact. Potential participants are approached by researchers, doctors who are conducting the trial, and they're invited to participate. In some cases, these subjects are going to be patients of the doctors that are conducting the trial, or they might be patients at the same hospital that the doctor practices at, or they could come in through some sort of recruiting mechanism. So some initial contact has been made to that subject and they've been asked to participate. So they need to understand what the purpose of the study is. It needs to be explained in clear language, and they need to know why the research is being conducted and what the researchers hope to achieve in conducting the trial. There's going to be some information disclosure. So you've got details related to the study. So the person that is conducting the consent needs to provide comprehensive information about the trial, what its purpose is, what the duration is, what are the required procedures that the subject is going to have to go through, and then who some of the key contacts are. We're going to go over this in a little more detail as we move along. In addition, the participant, the subject, needs to be made aware of what the risks and benefits are. So they need to be informed about any potential risks, discomforts, and benefits associated with the trial. So this might include possible side effects and how the study might benefit them or others. In some cases, there might be no benefit. In other cases, there could be significant benefit. But they need to be aware of what the benefits versus risks are before they decide to participate. In the ICF document, you're going to indicate what the alternative treatments are. So this would be information on available alternative treatments or procedures that are outside the clinical trial. Now, you could do this. You may not necessarily name all of these treatments in the document itself, but they need to be explained to the subject so they are made aware of them. Confidentiality is very important. So the process of maintaining the participant's privacy and confidentiality needs to be explained to the subject. So they're going to be given a subject number, and that's how they're going to be identified by the site by the doctor and the other site staff that are conducting the trial. And that's also how they're going to be identified in certain data that's collected during the trial. So they need to be aware that their identity is going to be protected, insofar as it can be protected by the site itself and any others that would have a valid reason for reviewing that subject's data. The subject needs to be told what compensation they're going to get for participating in the trial, and what the amount of that compensation is and how it's going to be paid out. So we've all heard stories of people that make their living by participating in clinical trials. Those are generally healthy subjects that are participating in phase 1 trials, where they're likely sequestered in a location for a period of time. It may be over the course of a weekend, or it might be 4 or 5 days at a time. And those trials generally, the compensation can be rather high. In most cases, the compensation is really for the time that the subject is involved in the trial, and the compensation is not going to be at a level where it would become considered coercive. It's important that they understand that their participation is voluntary. It's emphasized that participation is voluntary, and participants can withdraw at any time without any penalty or loss of benefits. They also need to be told what the process is, what the procedure is for their withdrawal. Normally, in some cases, they need to make that withdrawal request in writing, for instance. So that needs to be explained to the subject at the time that consent is obtained. Questions and answers. Now, this is very important. It's important that the study subjects be given ample opportunity to ask questions about the trial and have those questions answered and clarified to their satisfaction. So what that generally means is, more than likely, the principal investigator or a sub-investigator who's very familiar with the trial be available during the consent process so that the subject can ask questions of them. A lot of times in many trials, the coordinator might be the person that's obtaining consent. So they sometimes may not be the most authoritative person to answer questions about the trial. So it's important that the subject be given opportunity to ask questions, and that needs to be documented in the informed consent process. So you probably are going to have some type of comprehension check. So you're going to ask the patient a couple of questions and assess their understanding. So it's important that they really understand what it is they're signing up for and what their level of participation is going to be. So your informed consent form will be the document that the patient signs in order to authorize that they're going to participate in the trial. So it needs to be in very clear and understandable language, and that's also going to be something that is going to be reviewed by your IRB, your Institutional Review Board, to ensure that that document is adequate to explain all the aspects of the trial to the participant. So the participant is going to read that, or it could be read to them, but you need to spend time going over that with them and any family members that may be there. There may be a spouse involved. You could be doing a trial, conducting a trial in children where their parents are there, or perhaps their legal guardian. So whoever is there to participate in that, they need to have a chance to read through that consent document thoroughly and understand what's in it. In some cases, there will be a witness. In the case of a person who for some reason is not able to sign, either for legal reasons or for other reasons, you may have a participant or a witness that that witnesses the consent process and can verify that it was done properly and correctly. The process of ongoing consent sometimes comes up during your trial. You may receive information about the trial that needs to be communicated to the subject so that they can make an informed decision if they want to continue to participate in the trial. So that's part of the continuous consent process. In some cases, for instance, in the case of a protocol amendment, you may be required to reconsent the subject where you would have a completely new informed consent document that you would go over with the subject, and the process would be exactly the same as it is in the initial consent. You would you would go over that with them, answer their questions, have them date and sign the form, have the person obtaining consent date and sign the form, the same as you would with the initial consent. So this next element is very important. IRB approval. The informed consent process and documents have to be reviewed and approved by the Institutional Review Board before they can be used on your trial. What you will do is you will submit your informed consent form, and the IRB is going to review it, and if they may come back and have questions, and there may be a little back and forth on that happens very frequently. And then finally they will approve it, and they will stamp their approval date on that consent form, and then that will enable you to use it at that point. So you can't use that until it's been properly approved by your IRB. Now this regulatory compliance, this process must comply with applicable regulations and guidelines such as ICH, GCP guidelines, FDA regulations, and also local laws. So that's something you need to be aware of. There are local laws and standards that also apply to consenting subjects into a clinical trial. For example, if you're conducting a trial in the state of California, you have to give the California Bill of Rights to your subject for them to review and to sign off on. That becomes part of the informed consent process. Not every state does that. Other states have other requirements. For example, the state of Indiana has a requirement that the subject's contact information has to be included on the consent form. The state of Pennsylvania indicates that the principal investigator has to sign the consent form even if they're not the primary person obtaining consent for that subject. Now that's a guideline that many other states are using now. A lot of forms now, have a block for the principal investigator to sign. However, that does not mean that they have to actually be present during the informed consent. They might sign that document a day or two later, and that's fine. Pennsylvania is the only one that absolutely requires that the PI sign the form. So you need to be aware of whatever local laws might exist in your state that you're operating in. So the informed consent document must contain comprehensive information about the trial to ensure that patients can make an informed decision about whether or not they want to participate. So this has to be in clear, concise, and written language, and it has to be in a language that the participant can understand. So if you're conducting a trial and you've got Spanish language participants, the consent form needs to be written in Spanish. If you've got a subject that's only understands, say, Russian, for instance, you got to have a consent form that's written in the Russian language or whatever their native language is. So that's very important. There's also some very essential elements that are listed in the ICH-E6 guideline that we're going to go over, and these are required to be in the informed consent document. For example, the document has to contain information about the study. It's got to contain the title of the study. This becomes the official title of the clinical trial, and it has to include the approximate number of subjects that are participating in the trial, and it also needs to include the number of sites or centers around the country that are going to be enrolling subjects. So every trial that's going to go for FDA approval has to be listed on clinicaltrials.gov. So that same title has to appear on the informed consent as it is registered in that database. So there has to be a statement of purpose. This has to be a clear explanation of the purpose of the study and why it's being conducted. And it also has to be clear that it involves research. So you're doing a comparative between one study drug and an approved treatment, for example. That would be what the purpose would be. It's also got to contain what the subject's responsibilities are. What are they expected to do? They're expected to come back to the clinic, once every 15 days for a series of assessments, and that's supposed to go on for 3 months or whatever the duration of the trial is. They also have to undergo an ECG or an MRI or whatever study procedures they're supposed to do. Some of these might be done during the screening period, so those have to be spelled out. So what's done at each visit has to be spelled out in that document. There has to be a description of the procedures, detailed information about study procedures and what treatments are going to be done and when they're going to be done. It also has to include the probability of random assignment to each treatment. If you're working with a phase 3 trial, for instance, you're very likely going to be using a placebo arm. So you might have, say, a 2-to-1 randomization scheme where out of 3 patients, 2 patients get the treatment where 1 patient receives a placebo. And so that they need to be aware of what the likelihood is, what the probability is that they're going to be in one treatment arm versus another. It also has to include the duration. Trials are getting longer and longer. Some trials may last 2 or 3 years. Others may be shorter, where they only last 90 days or 120 days. But that has to be spelled out, and it has to be indicated what the subject is going to do at each visit. It has to indicate what the experimental aspects are, so identification of any experimental procedures or interventions. In some cases, the trial itself is experimental, so that needs to be communicated to the subject so that they understand what they're participating in. So potential risks. We refer to these as risks and discomforts. So this is a description of the foreseeable risks or discomforts, including physical, psychological, social, or economic harm. So that has to be spelled out, in the document itself. For example, if you're likely to experience, say, headache from the treatment, that needs to be spelled out. Side effects, information on known side effects of the interventions or treatment has to be listed in there as well. What are the potential benefits? That has to be discussed in the document. So, for example, if you're doing a diabetes study, maybe your unexpected benefit would be the lowering of H1C or A1C. There could be, if you're doing a weight loss study, could be the benefit of actually losing some weight. So that would be potential benefits. There's also got to be a statement in there that there's no guaranteed benefit, because this is not necessarily a treatment that they're going to necessarily benefit from. There could be a benefit, there could not be a benefit, but you can't make any guarantee that this is going to happen if they participate. There has to be disclosure of alternative procedures and treatments. These may be listed in the document, but this may, in many cases, be a discussion between the principal investigator and the subject so that they understand what alternative treatments are available and what the risks and benefits of those treatments are, so they can decide whether or not they want to participate in the trial. So confidentiality assurance, the subject needs to be told that their privacy is going to be protected as best it can be, because we can't guarantee complete protection, but we are going to be protected along the lines of HIPAA standards that you're probably familiar with. There's also going to be access to records of various third parties. Those will be members of the research team. The IRB is going to have access to those records, and there's access is going to be provided to regulatory authorities such as the FDA. So that they need to be told, the participant needs to be told, who is going to be accessing the data that's collected on the trial. That doesn't mean they're going to have access to the entire medical record or medical history of the participant, but it does mean that they're going to have access to the data that is collected during the trial on that particular subject. Whatever compensation is going to be due the subject needs to be in your document. This would include compensation for participating in the trial. It would also include any compensation or treatment available for any trial-related injury. It's important to understand that while the subject is participating in the trial, their medical care is going to be taken care of by the principal investigator. They're going to be responsible for that, and that needs to be spelled out as far as what compensation could be available in the event they have a trial-related injury. Also, whatever costs are going to be associated. You may have travel costs, for instance. Your travel costs might be reimbursed. You might be in a situation where the participant would be reimbursed, say, for a hotel room or for airfare or other travel expense, or it could be clear that they're not going to be compensated for that. But whatever the case, that needs to be in your document that you're using to consent to subject. So let's talk about voluntary participation, because it's very important. It has to be clear to the participants, to the subjects, that their participation is voluntary. They can choose not to participate if they want to. They can discontinue their participation at any point during the trial, and they won't have any loss of benefits as a result of that. They do have the right to withdraw, and there could be circumstances where they might actually be terminated from the trial by the investigator. These could be instances where their medical baseline might change and they're no longer eligible, or they no longer meet the eligibility for the trial. It could be that they're not compliant with the trial procedures. That does happen every once in a while. And so the investigator can choose to drop a participant for one of those reasons if they feel it's not best for the participant to continue in that trial. In the event that there is new information that becomes known during the course of the trial, that information has to be made available to the subject, because that may impact the subject's willingness to continue with the trial. That can be made in the form of a phone call. It can be made in person, a discussion with the PI, or it might be made in writing. But it does need to be made available to the participant. And then also they need to be aware of what the duration, what is the expected duration of the trial, when are they going to be finished with it. Another section of the document is going to be research contacts. That's going to be the names and contact information for the principal investigator and any other members of the research team that the subject needs to be aware of. It's also there's a section in the consent form to explain their rights and how they can register a complaint about the trial. That would be how they contact the study team, how they contact the institutional review board. That could be an address, could be a phone number, could be an email, but there needs to be contact information in there for how they report some type of concern or complaint about the trial. So there needs to be a consent statement in there that indicates that the subject they've discussed the trial, they understand what the trial is about, and they've made voluntary agreement to participate. And then finally, you've got signature lines in there, signature lines for the subject, also for the person obtaining consent, and for a witness if a witness is required. You very likely will have a separate signature line for the principal investigator, and you may have the signature lines if you're doing a study in children or adolescents. You'll have lines, signature lines in there for the parent. That could be only one parent, could be both parents. It depends on what the level of risk is for the subject. But those will be the signature lines that you'll need on your consent form. There could be these are additional elements as they may apply. So for instance, participation in future research. You may have a statement in there where the subject can determine whether or not they want to participate in future research, where they might initial and date that statement that's in the consent form. This also will include or can include whether or not there are any specimens that are collected can be stored for additional research at some point in the future. Also, information on how they can withdraw their data. This may apply to certain studies. In most cases, whatever data has been collected on the subject will remain in the clinical database. Of course, that data is going to be de-identified, so no one's going to know who the subject was. But there could be situations where they are allowed to withdraw their data from the study. Also, commercial profit, indication that whether or not they're going to share in any commercial profit. Normally, in almost every case, they would not, but there could be studies where they could, so that needs to be listed in there as to whether or not they're going to share in that. In most cases, they will not. So you've got some reading assignments. The chapter in your textbook regarding informed consent. Also, the section in ICH E6 R2 that discusses informed consent, which is section 4. And I've also included several articles here that discuss the consent process, and I think that'll help amplify what I've discussed in this lecture and what you've learned, and help to answer whatever questions you may have. So I've made these articles available for you on Blackboard, so take a look at them. I think you'll find them to be rather interesting. I think it's important that you get a pretty good understanding of what those essential pieces of information that have to be in the consent form, what they are, why they're there, and what they're meant to communicate to the subject. So these articles will kind of help bolster your understanding of that. Then finally, for your online discussion forum assignment for this week, I've put on Blackboard an informed consent checklist. So this checklist discusses all the elements that we've gone over in this lecture. I've also provided an informed consent document. And so what you're going to do is take that checklist and compare it with the document and make sure that they're all there, or if there are any that are missing. So spend some time on that. I'd like for you to identify if there are any elements that are missing, and then provide your assessment on the discussion forum, and then I can comment on that during the week. So good luck to you, and let me know what questions you have.